Everyone, thank you for joining us today. My name is Christy Allen, and I'm a board member with BTFC, and I'm really happy to be here with you today to talk about the basics of clinical trials with Dr. Dawn Richards. She's the Director of Patient and Public Engagement at Clinical Trials Ontario. So we just want to start with a land acknowledgement. We acknowledge that the Brain Tumor Foundation of Canada is located on the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, Attawandaron, and Wendat peoples. We honor and respect the history, languages, and culture of the diverse Indigenous people who call this territory home. We move forward with a profound sense of gratitude and respect for the land and its original caretakers, and are grateful to have the opportunity to work and live in this territory. So welcome to our webinar series. This is designed for anyone impacted by a brain tumor, patients, survivors, caregivers, and volunteers, as well as healthcare professionals and researchers seeking to expand their knowledge. Our sessions explore a wide range of topics, including neuro-oncology, neurosurgery, research advancements, psychosocial oncology, mental health, caregiver support, and more. So just a few quick housekeeping notes. The webinar will be recorded, and a link to the recording will be shared with all registrants within 1 week of the webinar. And this recording will also be available on our website. We do have dedicated time at the end of the presentation for questions and discussion, so please send your questions through the Q&A function on Zoom. Please try and avoid sending them through the chat, and just keep in mind we won't be able to answer individual specific questions, and we encourage you to contact your healthcare team if you're looking for specific advice. The chat is open though if you want to connect with the speaker and other panelists. With that, we'll move into a couple polls just to see who's in the audience today. Wonderful. Thank you so much. I also see we have lots of new folks today, so welcome and welcome back to folks who've joined us before. So I'm now very excited to introduce Dr. Dawn Richards. She's the founder of 502 Labs Inc. and the Director of Patient and Public Engagement at Clinical Trials Ontario. With a PhD in Analytical Chemistry from the University of Alberta and experience in a variety of roles over the past 20 years, it is her diagnosis with rheumatoid arthritis in 2006 that started her journey to combine her passion for science with making the most of her diagnosis. In her role at CTO, Dawn is charged with executing on CTO's strategic pillar of patient and public engagement. So welcome. Thank you, Dr. Richards, for joining us today and sharing your time and expertise.
Thank you so much for having me here. And thank you to all of you in advance for spending part of your day with me. So I'm here to talk a bit about the basics of clinical trials. I'm not going to speak to anything specific related to any one trial, but really it's my goal to help you know a little bit more about what trials are, how you might find a trial if you are interested, and a bit about participating in or leaving a clinical trial and helping you understand kind of what your rights are as someone if you do choose to participate in a trial. I'm going to be kind of preoccupied with the slides, but happy for you to post things into the Q&A as we go. We're going to try and answer as many questions as we can before the end of the webinar. If we don't get to all the questions, please also know that I'm happy for you to contact me separately, or Majora is going to keep track of the questions that I don't have time to respond to so we can get answers for you. So I'm here representing an organization called Clinical Trials Ontario. So just a little bit about CTO. We're primarily funded by the Government of Ontario with the goal to make Ontario a better place to do clinical trials. So it's all about improving the environment in which we do trials. CTO has three strategic priorities. One is to streamline the processes related to doing trials. They can be cumbersome. Clinical trials are highly regulated. And the point is to really be able to focus on the science of the trials versus all the paperwork and all of the things that are required to start trials. The work that I do is engaging, like we're doing today, helping people to understand more about trials so they can make decisions that work for them about participation. And I also work with patient partners in my own work at CTO, and we encourage trial teams to be working with patient, caregiver, family member, public partners in their work in clinical trials as well. Lastly, we promote Ontario as a place to do trials. And while I'm based in Ontario and I'm part of an Ontario-based organization, it's really important for you to know that clinical trials are regulated at a national level in Canada. So anything that I'm going to be talking about today applies to trials all across Canada, not just trials in Ontario. Everything that I'm going to be talking today about can be found at CTO's website. The link is here for you, as well as a QR code. And again, as part of my work in the Engage pillar at CTO, all of the work that I do is in partnership with patients, families, caregivers. We have a group of people that's called our College of Lived Experience, and they support me in my work at CTO. And all of the information that's coming to you in this webinar has been information that we have worked on together. So let's start with some of the basics about clinical trials generally. So what are these things in the first place? They are a type of research. It's really important to know that while sometimes people seek out a trial to seek out treatment options, they are still research. They are designed to test health-related interventions. Intervention's a fancy word for treatment or therapy, and we want to see what the outcomes related to using those therapies are. Clinical trials are designed to answer specific questions, and those questions might be things like, is the treatment safe in people? Does the treatment improve or cure disease? Or maybe help people live longer with that disease than other treatments? Does it improve their quality of life? Does it make them feel better? And while we often think about clinical trials testing drugs, they can also be used to test other so-called interventions. Or it might be a combination of these interventions. So that might be something like a device, maybe a pacemaker, or in Parkinson's, sometimes there's implantable devices. It might be a specific type of surgery. It might be a new approach to radiation therapy, could be imaging or other diagnostic procedures, and it could be things like diet and lifestyle interventions. And ironically, while I've said many other things besides drugs can be studied in clinical trials, we're actually, for the sake of simplicity, we're going to focus on clinical trials as they relate to drug interventions. So another important thing to know about is that there's obviously reasons why we do clinical trials as research. They provide us with data or evidence about the intervention or the treatment that's tested. And that data can be used by a lot of different people. So it might be used by people living with different conditions to help them understand like the robustness of the clinical trial and if they think it's a good option for them. It might be used by people at Health Canada to make decisions about what interventions can actually be widely marketed and approved, might be used by our provincial decision makers about what kinds of things go on formularies, used by healthcare providers in terms of treatment options, used by researchers to decide what other kind of research they're going to do. So really, clinical trials provide evidence, and not just for one group of people, it's actually for a really wide range of people. And it helps us decide what therapies or other interventions might work best in people. So you may have heard of things called treatment guidelines. Treatment guidelines are also built on the evidence that clinical trials provides us. So lots of people use clinical trials. Sponsors use the data from clinical trials too to decide whether or not they're going to move something forward. So hopefully that gives you a kind of a range of ideas about who's invested in clinical trials and the evidence that they provide us. So I will talk about the different phases of clinical trials specifically for drugs. It's important to know that when something starts in the clinical trial, so-called pipeline, it doesn't always get to the end. In fact, there's a lot of challenges throughout this pipeline that might prevent something from actually moving all the way through the pipeline and becoming widely available to people. So we'll talk briefly about each of these different phases. And each of these different phases of trials is really created to answer different questions. And so to provide us with different evidence that then builds the evidence base for, in this case, our hypothetical drug. Another thing that's really important to know is we don't take the decision lightly to move, for example, in this case, a drug into people. There's often many years of research that's done on a drug before it's put into people and before that's actually approved to be put into people. It often undergoes a lot of understanding around biology, a lot of research around biology, a lot of research in different cell types, in different types of animals. So all kinds of things are done. And this gives us a good evidence base that tells us that this, in our case, hypothetical drug would be a good candidate to go into people. But we really don't know how these experimental drugs will work until we undertake clinical trials in people. Okay, so let's assume that our hypothetical drug has been so-called greenlit for a phase 1 clinical trial. These studies are called first in humans. This is the first time the drug is being given to people. And their aim, so phase 1 trials, the aim is to establish, is this safe in people? So I've told you the evidence will generally point to it being safe in people, but we don't actually know until humans take, in this case, our hypothetical drug. We generally have an idea of what the dose should be or the dose range that goes into people. And we will be studying the side effect information. Again, we should have an idea of what potential side effects will be, but once it goes into people, we'll have a better understanding. This is done in a really small number of participants. I've just put like a guidance here. So small number of participants, these participants are really closely monitored. And the other thing I wanted to share with you is I've kind of neatly placed these as phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, phase 4. Depending on the area, if it's a rare disease, etc., sometimes these phases can be combined. Sometimes the numbers of people that you'll see here as kind of a guide will be a lot less or might be more, all those kinds of things. So I'm kind of using this as general guidance. You may see different things out there, and I don't want you to be alarmed by that if you do see something that's different from me or what I'm showing you here. So at the end of a phase 1 study, depending on how our drug has performed, if it's met its endpoints, it's safe, the side effect profile looks like those side effects are less than what the potential benefits are, let's just assume that we are going to take our hypothetical drug to the next phase. So this would be phase 2. It can now go into more people if that's an option for whatever disease area this is. So it might be in the low hundreds of people. Here we're looking to see, and I forgot to mention, in phase 1, generally these individuals are considered to be healthy volunteers. So they usually don't have the indication for which the drug is being studied. In phase 2, we're looking to make sure that the drug does what it's supposed to do in people with the condition that it's intended for. So that's called efficacy. Does the drug do what it's supposed to do in people? We're learning more about the appropriate dose that should be given for our drug, and we're continuing to monitor side effects. So often when the drug goes into larger numbers of people, we get a better idea of the side effect information as well, even though we'll have it in small numbers of people too. So we have a generally larger number of participants in phase 2 because critically we've identified that this drug is safe to be in people. Whoops. And before we go into phase 3, the phase 2 studies usually take a little bit longer than the phase 1 studies. And again, important to know that our drug, for a variety of reasons, may or may not go onto phase 3, into a phase 3 trial. That could range from it didn't hit its phase 2 endpoints, or maybe whoever's running the trial doesn't have the money for it to go to the next phase. It could be a variety of reasons, but we're going to assume that our drug keeps moving along the clinical trial pipeline. So what's phase 3? Phase 3 clinical trials for drugs, you might hear them called randomized clinical trials, or RCTs for short. These are often considered kind of like the gold standard for clinical trials and for making comparisons to existing studies and for example, drugs here that are out there. So they're called randomized because the participants in this phase of a trial are assigned by chance to one of the interventions, and that's done to reduce the bias when we look at the evidence that comes out of the phase 3 study. So in this phase of clinical trials, the drug may be given to thousands of people if it's an indication where there are thousands of people. And the idea is to understand now that we know it's safe and we know that it does what it's supposed to do in people with this condition, we want to see how long those effects last. We want to really learn more and zero in on what the dose is that should be given to people here. And we continue to learn about side effects. So again, as it goes into more and more people, we might learn more about side effects. So large numbers of participants here. And again, you might hear these called RCTs. And so this is where we're comparing 2 or more interventions or treatment arms. So for example, if this is in an indication where there's a standard of care already for a drug, then this phase of a study might be our hypothetical drug that's compared to a group of people who are on the standard of care already. At this point, if the drug meets its endpoints for the study, so it looks good in terms of the data, whoever is running this study, so the sponsor or the research team that's running this study, they can apply to Health Canada to have this particular drug approved. So in regulatory terms, it's called approved, and that's when when Health Canada would look at all of the data and they would decide about whether or not this hypothetical drug can be widely given to people in Canada. So if it could be widely marketed in Canada. Sometimes phase 4 studies are done. So this is after the drug is widely available and on market. And so, for example, sometimes sponsors, so drug companies, will continue to monitor what things look like once the drug is widely available on the market. So this might be now available in tens of thousands of people. And because this drug is now approved by Health Canada to be marketed, these studies are sometimes called post-marketing surveillance. So it's after the drug comes to market and things are being watched here. The interesting thing with phase 4 studies is they help us to study like the longer term side effects of drugs that aren't necessarily, or interventions that we can't necessarily study within the shorter time frames of the phases up to this point. And because it's going into really large numbers of people, things that maybe didn't present obviously in the clinical trials may now present themselves. So there are some quite well-known cases where drugs have come to market and become widely available, and sometimes have been taken off the market because of some of the things that have started to appear after they've gone into large numbers of people, or the doses have been adjusted, etc. So, once it goes into a large, as I mentioned, a large number of people, things start to present that maybe weren't as obvious in smaller numbers of people. Okay, so that's a bit about all of the phases of clinical trials for drugs. And as I mentioned, even though something does start in the clinical trial pathway, it doesn't mean necessarily that it's going to make it through all of those phases and become something that's widely available. I often get asked about the concept of placebo. So this is an important thing for me to share with you about, like, what is placebo actually, and the ethics of placebos. So a placebo is an inactive therapy that looks exactly like the active therapy. So for example, in a clinical trial, if the active therapy that's being studied is a tiny white pill with, let's say, a letter A on it, then the placebo that it's being compared to would look exactly the same. And it would have be a tiny white pill with an A on it, just like the active therapy. So people wouldn't know the difference between these things, except that one would have the active ingredient in it and one would not. The idea is that the placebo doesn't have any effect on the condition that's being studied. And again, just like randomization, a placebo is used to make the results of the study more reliable. Important to know that if there is a standard of care for a condition or disease, then a placebo and using a placebo would not be considered ethical and would not happen. However, if there's no standard of care for a condition or disease, a placebo may be used. And this might be something that you ask about if you're interested in participating in a clinical trial, is what the comparisons are, or if placebo is used, depending on the phase of the study. So I know that people here are interested in how you go about finding a clinical trial. Some ways you might do that, you might talk to a healthcare provider. Sometimes depending on who that person is or how plugged in they are to clinical trials, they might have a lot of information for you, or they might not have a lot of information. They might be willing to help you out with it though. There are health charities and patient organizations that can help point you in the right direction, or sometimes they're able to help you find a clinical trial, or they might just have good information for you to help you make a decision as well. But that's another option. You might contact a hospital or an organization that does research. They will often be able to, again, either help you or point you in the right direction. There are sometimes ads on newspaper, TV, and radio for clinical trials. Those are legitimate. They're often for phase 1 studies, but that might be an option for you. And then I've got a plug here for Clinical Trials Ontario's Clinical Trial Finder. And this is something that pulls from a very large global database that's based in the US. It's not an entirely comprehensive database, but it's one of the larger databases. It's called clinicaltrials.gov. The CTO Trial Finder limits things that come back from your search to, it can be limited to Canada, a specific province or territory, or you can even type in your postal code and tell it how far from your postal code you'd like to find a trial. At the very minimum, in that clinical trial finder, you need to put your condition of interest. But it's a lot simpler than going to the main database, which is, like I mentioned, a global database. And sometimes it's not super friendly. So we've worked on this with our patient and public partners to develop something that's a little bit easier to use and hopefully a little bit less intimidating too. Obviously, when you're looking at different clinical trials, you might ask how you can tell whether it's reputable or credible. And so these are some of the things that we've come up with that are good for you to ask questions about, or to do a bit of a dig around and do some of your own research. But really, if you wanted to ask a trial team any of these questions, they would be more than willing to answer them for you. If they're a bit cagey about them or a bit standoffish about them, that might be a red flag for you about why they don't want to answer these types of questions. So one of the things to look for is that the costs of the trial, such as the study treatment, will be covered by the study itself. So, for example, you should not be asked, and I've seen this before, to spend thousands of dollars to pay for the study treatment. Like, that is just a giant red flag, or some kind of like entrance fee, also a giant red flag. You might have to cover some costs like parking or transportation. Maybe it's your time to be part of the study. Sometimes you might even travel to a different city or province. You can sometimes get some of those costs reimbursed, but I do know people who have paid for their own fairly extensive travel, but that's something to ask about. The second thing is what are the qualifications of the clinical trial team? When you look at these people online, have they been in this area for a long time? What kind of credentials do they have? They may be affiliated with a reputable institution, an academic institution, or a clinical center. Those are important things to look for. In Canada, the clinical trial application has to be reviewed by Health Canada and approved by Health Canada. So that's a question you can ask. For a legitimate clinical trial, no one should be, dismissive of that kind of question. The clinical trial will have also had to been reviewed and approved by what's called a research ethics board. And a research ethics board looks at the clinical trial kind of globally from the perspective of the welfare and the safety of the participants who are going to be asked to participate in that study. So you can definitely ask if the trial has been approved by a so-called REB, that's Research Ethics Board for short. And the institution or the organization where the trial is hosted are taking on the potential liability of hosting that study there. So they would have also reviewed and approved that clinical trial. So all things for you to ask. The next thing is, even if you've determined that this clinical trial kind of meets all of those things for you, this determining whether it's a good clinical trial for you and if you'd like to pursue it to be a participant, the first 5 things are the same as the last slide. The last thing is you have to meet what's called the eligibility criteria to be in a trial. That's kind of like a checklist of things that the participants in the study need to meet. And so those might be things like age, might be living or staying within a certain radius of where the clinical trial is happening. You might have to have a certain diagnosis, those types of things. So those would be important things that you would talk to the trial team about once you've determined that you'd like to consider participation in the study. There are other options out there. Clinical trials aren't the only option for you. These are just some of them. And, important for you to consider all of your options. One might be receiving no treatment. One might be receiving standard treatment or a different form of treatment than what you're currently on. Maybe you want to participate in a different research study, or maybe there's something else that's out there for you. Whatever that is, it might be helpful for you to talk to somebody you trust, if that's a doctor or another healthcare provider. Chat with them about the potential known benefits and risks of these other options or of a clinical trial, if that's the route that you'd like to go. Sometimes you can't find a trial, or you can't find a trial that's near you, and there might be some other options for you. You could just contact the study team, see if, even though the trial's in another location, if there's a potential for you to be able to participate. Sometimes there is some funding for participants to be able to travel, or maybe you have your own funding, right? I don't know what people's individual situations are, but nonetheless, I would encourage you to reach out to the study team and ask questions about it. Maybe there are also ways to bring the trial closer to you. So I do know people who have advocated for trials to come to sites closer to them. That may take a lot of time, it may take a lot of energy, but it's a possibility. And I've also known people who have seen that trials are opening up, but they haven't been so close to home. And they've held out for a bit. And at another date and time, the trial has then come to a location closer to home. So they've been watching, for example, global trials where sometimes they will open in other countries first. But if you live in a large center, sometimes those trials will end up in your large center. So those are some possibilities if what you're looking for isn't out there at the moment. Another thing to be really clear on is even if your healthcare provider offers you a clinical trial, you shouldn't feel pressured to say yes to that trial. It's a really personal decision. It's up to you. Only you and those around you that are important to you can help you make that decision. Your healthcare provider might be, an important person that you talk to about it, but please don't feel pressured. And that certainly shouldn't change your relationship with that individual if you decide not to participate in a clinical trial that they've suggested. Okay, I'm going to head into the last part of the webinar, which is you understanding, what it's like to make a decision to participate and even maybe make a decision to withdraw from a clinical trial, which is always an option, even if you've started to participate in one. So there's a really important part of participating in clinical trials that's called informed consent. And sometimes people assume that this is only signing a consent form. That's part of informed consent, but the broader part of informed consent is it being a process. And it being a process where you ask questions at any time about understanding, what being in the trial is, maybe what your roles and responsibilities are, and, understanding the different tests that you might undertake, etc. So really important to understand that your consent to participate in a clinical trial is voluntary. You can also decide at any time to withdraw from a clinical trial. And as I mentioned, consent really is this ongoing process. So it's not just signing a form at the start, but it is, making sure that you're informed throughout your participation. It's you asking questions, it's the healthcare team really explaining things, the study team really explaining things to you as well. If you do decide to withdraw, you can request that any information or any samples that you provided also be removed from the study. Those things may or may not be possible for a variety of reasons, but it's certainly within your right to request that. The other thing to understand is that all clinical trials will have different potential benefits and risks. This is part of that really personal decision where it's up to you to decide if you feel like the potential benefits will outweigh the potential risks of you participating in that clinical trial. The different potential benefits and risks will be described in the informed consent form, and you're really encouraged to ask any and all questions you have about any of those until you feel satisfied and you feel like you really understand what's being presented to you so that you can make a decision about your participation. I've talked also that even if you decide to participate in a clinical trial, it's voluntary. Remember to participate. And so if you decide at any point that being in the clinical trial is just really no longer within your best interests, you can withdraw from it. You don't have to provide a reason for your withdrawal. You might be asked for one, but again, you don't have to provide any kind of reason. In helping you make your decision, you're really encouraged to talk to the study doctor and staff about your decision, about any questions you have before you make that decision. So again, it's part of that informed consent and really making sure that you're informed when you make that decision. You might be asked some questions about your experience before you formally leave the study. And it's important to also talk to the study team because you might also be asked to have some lab tests done or some physical exams so that you can safely be removed from the study. So sometimes I've talked to people and they said, I'm going to leave this trial. I'm just not going to talk to the study team about it. I've made my decision already. And that's okay for you to make the decision to withdraw. But again, talk to the study team to understand how you can safely withdraw from the study. And again, just that note that you may be able to withdraw your permission to use any data or any samples that were collected from you as well. Okay, so I'll just wrap things up here. Again, just to reiterate that everything that I've talked about today was developed with patient and public partners. You're, happy for you to look around our website, and the website's kind of set up so that depending on where you are in making your decision about being in a trial, there's all different types of questions for you to consider and to ask, and there's some answers there for you as well. And I'll just leave you with my email address. I'm happy if you think of something after the end of the webinar that you would like to ask for you to please go ahead and contact me. I'm always happy to have a chat with someone or to get a response to a question for them. And so with that, I will stop sharing and happy to answer any kinds of questions here.
That was wonderful. Thank you so much, Sean. It was very straightforward and you explained everything very well, so thank you. We'll now move into a few questions. So again, please feel free to add any questions you might have into the Q&A box. It's just at the bottom of your Zoom panel right there. But we'll start with a question. In all of the phases that you described, would there be both a control group and a treatment group?
That's a great question, Elaine. So the answer to that is no. So for example, in the phase one stage of things, there's only one group of people. And here we're looking at if the treatment that's under study is safe for people. So there's not a so-called control and treatment group. Everyone here is getting the treatment, basically. Same with phase two studies. Often we're just looking at whether or not this thing does what it's supposed to do. So not all of the phases will have a so-called comparator. Phase three studies definitely do, because we want to take a look at, what the treatment group looks like and what their outcomes look like versus a so-called control group. And we didn't talk about all the kinds of funky designs that can happen too, but sometimes in some phase three studies, there might be separate groups, and then a little ways into the study, both groups might be offered the treatment, etc. So I kind of gave you just like the simplest overview of things, but there's lots of nuances in terms of how things can be studied as well.
That's great. Thank you. I'm seeing another question. Is the information that you shared suitable for the pediatric population, or are there any differences as well?
Yeah, that's a great question. Pediatric populations are what we kind of consider a more vulnerable population, and obviously children cannot consent. And so the difference there is that there would be, their parents or their guardians would be involved in some of the consent processes. And probably some of what happens is on a smaller scale than what we see here as well. It's really interesting, though, if I can just kind of say things as an aside, that often things are not well studied in children or pregnant persons. And so there's often, even though things come to market, many things in the pediatric space are provided in what would be considered like off-label because they haven't been studied well in clinical trial settings. But there's this real, in the past few years, this real push to make sure that we are actually studying treatments and interventions in these populations so that we can more accurately treat those individuals based on really good evidence. So that's an excellent question. Yes, pediatric populations have some major differences.
Absolutely. Thank you. So there's another question. How often should we expect to see new clinical trials specifically for brain cancer and glioblastoma pop up in Ontario? And how often should folks be referring to the CTO clinical trial finder?
That is, I've never had that question before, Hazel. So thank you for a new question. So I can't speak specifically to the brain cancer glioblastoma space. I would just encourage you to put a bit of a reminder for yourself to maybe refer to the trial finder on a regular basis. I'm not super familiar with what the pipeline looks like. So I can't give you a good answer except to say maybe put a regular kind of reminder on there for yourself to check things out.
That's great. Thank you. I'm seeing one other question here. So, if someone consents to be in a clinical trial and they're randomized to the placebo or control group, would they know that? And then if they were to drop out, how would that affect the trial results?
Yeah, that's a great question. So sometimes people are aware of their assignments. So I can give an example where last year I actually was in a clinical trial, and full disclosure, I actually wanted to be in the trial because I wanted access to the treatment. Um, and I was randomized, and I found out because they were letting people know that I did not get the treatment. So I was like, great, there's a 1 in 2 chance I could be randomized to the treatment arm, and I didn't get it, but I still decided to participate in the clinical trial anyway. So sometimes people are made aware of which treatment arm they will be in. Sometimes they're not, and that just all depends on how the study has been designed. Usually phase 3 studies where this happens are quite large in number. So if you decide to withdraw from this study, it should not have a huge impact on data. Things are usually designed to take into account that sometimes people, like might leave the study. Um, and you can ask if you don't know which treatment arm you were in, you can ask afterwards if you can find out which treatment arm you were in. The study team may or may not be able to let you know about that. And while it's an anecdote, I do know of people who have been in studies that have been so-called blinded, so they were not aware or not told which treatment arm they were in, but it soon became very obvious to them due to the efficacy of the treatment that they were in the treatment arm. So sometimes the treatment arm discloses itself. That's not always the case at all, but sometimes for things that are very effective, or for things where there haven't been good options before, they may basically present themselves. So
That's great. Thank you. I'm seeing another couple questions here, and if you don't know the answer, that's okay. But there's a question around clinical trials for cancer specifically. So some folks are asking whether there is or is not a placebo, or would someone instead receive a different treatment?
yeah, so a couple of things. It really depends on the space. If there's not a treatment already, then a placebo might be considered ethical within the study. If there is a standard of care already for that particular cancer, then it would not be ethical to design a study where people would be made to go off a standard of care to take a placebo. That would not be something that happens. So it all depends on what the standard of care or options already are.
Great, thank you. And I think I have maybe one last question, unless any
Sure.
more come in, but I know there's the trial finder on the CTO website and lots of resources there, but do you have any other recommendations for resources, maybe for understanding too some of the language and different concepts that can be kind of tricky when you're reading through things that
Yeah.
confirm consent, that sort of thing?
So we do have on the CTO site, we have a bit of a glossary. It's pretty limited, but there is one there for you. I will get back to you on, there's a really great glossary that the National Cancer Institute in the US has. Um, and it's actually specific to cancer, but it's got a bunch of other great words that I just recommend to people generally about science and research. So I'll find the exact link for that, and I'll share it with people because it's got just a lot of really great terms that you often hear. And I'll make sure that I can get that into the hands of everyone who's part of the webinar today.
Amazing. Well, thank you so much, Dawn. This was great.